so much for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. On behalf of the team at PKI Solutions, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Role of Code Signing Digital Supply Chains in the Era of SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline Attacks. We'll be covering what digital supply chains are, valuable insights around code signing's role in the supply chain, and what needs to happen to strengthen protections and prevent ransomware attacks in this space in the future. We'll also have time for Q&A toward the end of the hour, so be sure to drop your questions in the chat or Q&A tab throughout the presentation. After the webinar, we'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn or Twitter, both at PKI Solutions, and hear what you think. Be sure to register for our next event coming up Thursday, July 8th at 10 a.m. Pacific, our office hours live. As always, office hours is totally free, and you can come get your questions answered directly from the PKI Solutions team. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters for today. First, we have Mark B. Cooper, founder and president of PKI Solutions, also known as the PKI Guy. Mark is a former Microsoft senior engineer and subject matter expert for Microsoft Active Directory Certificate Services. He's traveled the globe supporting customers and clients in their PKI environments, including a number of Fortune 500 companies. He's been a trusted advisor in all things PKI to a multitude of organizations. We're also excited to welcome Ted Shorter, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of KeyFactor today. Ted is responsible for KeyFactor's intellectual property efforts and helps align KeyFactor's focus with the changing security landscape. Ted is passionate about helping his clients understand the importance of crypto agility. Mark, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you to get us started.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Natalie. Hey, Ted, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic.
Well, as Natalie said, we're going to spend a little time today kind of talking about digital supply chains and code signing. And, you know, this is an interesting one where as we started thinking about what are some of the top problems organizations are facing today, you know, honestly, this concept of a digital supply chain probably hasn't had a lot of lexicon for a while. Is this a term that you guys come across quite a bit, Ted?
In certain segments. So we do work in the automotive space. They're very aware of their supply chains and so forth. Mm-hmm. I think for a lot of folks, even in the software, you know, ISV space, while there's a general awareness of that the supply chain exists, they don't really think about it that way.
Exactly. And, you know, I think it's kind of pertinent in that, you know, a lot of organizations, when we think about software or IoT, we don't have the traditional model of, you know, open up a box of software and you've got some physical media that's got a hologram from Microsoft or somewhere else. It's all kind of digitalized now. And whether it's the software or updates or firmware, it's kind of a new paradigm for organizations. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what the heck is a digital supply chain. You know, why is this something a lot of organizations have some role in? Talk a little bit about what we've seen as a result of SolarWinds and Colonial pipeline. We'll talk about some of the risks that are out there for organizations and some of the things that they can definitely take a look at to remediate those risks. We'll talk a little bit about secure code inception to cradle to grave kind of an approach and obviously do some questions. So now when we talk about digital supply chain, this is really kind of a different world for me. I know when I started working with computers, it was really audio cassette tapes that you would kind of put software on, right? You know, you plug it in your Commodore 64 or something like that.
Same here. Yep.
Yeah. And then over time, you know, Windows would be on floppy disks and you'd go through 34 different disks installed, but you at least knew where that software came from. Or maybe if you picked it up somewhere else, you'd put your own label on there, but you could at least kind of tell, hey, this is a Microsoft disk. We had a pretty good idea of what our supply chain was. It came from the electronics store. It came from a box from Microsoft or Adobe or whoever. Our software supply chain was really very simple at that point. And now we kind of really look beyond that. We have, I know I interact with app stores on my phone and even Windows. You know, I assume that you probably even come across this in other platforms too. I think like even Adobe has a plugin store in other types of places.
Sure.
I'm not an Android guy. And I don't know if you are. If you ever work with the Google Play Store, is that what they call it?
I actually my main phone is an Android, and have played around with things in the Google Play Store for sure.
Yeah. So I know, at least for me, when I kind of think about my supply chain, I have a reasonable level of assumption that something coming from the Apple Store or the Google Store or the Microsoft Store is secure, and there's vetting. I mean, the assumption is that they're kind of doing a certain amount of validation and testing of code and all those types of things. And I'm sure the Google one is exactly the same way. When we think about the ability to effectively buy software for our organizations or individually, in order for that to be trustworthy, there has to be some effective tunnel, really something that gets from that developer until it arrives on my end. There has to be a trusted life cycle. And I think one of the places that I know you play in quite a bit is, how does a developer really ensure what they created today winds up in the hands of their consumer, whether that's a business or an individual, in a secure way, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of aspects to that, right? I mean, certainly, every release of key factor command platform is signed. Every single binary within the release is signed. We go to great lengths to protect the signing keys that are used to sign. And I think there's a lot of, if you break this down, I think we'll kind of get into that throughout the hour. There are a lot of places where you can attack a digital supply chain. One of them is around the signing itself, the protection of signing keys, so that someone else can't steal those and use them. There's, of course, also just the fact that most modern day software platforms are made up of source that the company selling the software creates, and a set of open source libraries that they make use of. And in the cryptography space, there's a number of those that are in play as well, that are used by products all over the place. And so I think a lot of I think the first step we sort of look at protecting our own house, right? So that there's a whole bunch of analysis we do on things that we write, the things that we create. Come in and do stuff. We have static analysis tools that run all the time, and so forth. And then when we sign everything that we release with keys that are very carefully protected in an HSM, generated in HSM, et cetera. That piece I think is obviously very strong. But and I don't think key factor is not at all unique in this, right? There are components that make up our web UI that are open source, the React frameworks and that sort of stuff for the web GUI. There's open source cryptographic pieces that are used in various places by different folks. There's OpenSSL. Actually, interesting enough, key factor actually today we officially have completed it was announced earlier in the year. Completed a merger with the folks at PrimeKey over in Sweden and Germany, and they have a presence in Australia and the US as well. But PrimeKey has been in the open source cryptography space for quite a while, right? They have an open source CA stack. They also made an acquisition of Crypto Workshop, which has ownership basically of the Bouncy Castle crypto stack, between those two pieces of open source, those things are used in all kinds of products all over the place.
Exactly. And to me, that's kind of the fascinating thing here, is because not only are you, it's almost kind of like the old hair club for men kind of commercials. Like, I liked it so much, I bought it. Right. For you guys, it's you're not just selling a code signing solution, and there's many ways to do code signing, but you're also in a place where you have to sign your own stuff, and yes. Everything you do, whether it's that product or some other product that and I think you're right, touching on open source, one of the challenges is okay, garbage in, garbage out. If you bring in a piece of code and you're not doing analysis on the code and you sign it, it's still going to do bad things. It's a tough problem. If the intent is we write code, we sign it, we get it to the customer, and nothing's changed. But if there's a problem from the beginning, that really kind of says the supply chain kind of starts at the source code level, not just I sign it and I ship it out my door. It really is that cradle to grave approach.
100%. And as you mentioned, like we are both now a consumer and a producer of, this sort of software supply chain piece.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's important. It's important, as there's a lot of power in open source and the ability for community to contribute, to inspect, to help secure, so forth. But we have seen, the rise of malicious pull requests, right? Things like that. The University of Minnesota was banned from ever contributing to the Linux kernel because as a research project, they I don't know if you saw that, but they provided some malicious updates to the Linux kernel that actually made it in.
Oh,
part of a research project, and then turned around and said, "Hey, well, see, there's an issue here because these malicious things were accepted," and the Linux kernel people were not terribly pleased with the research methodology, and it basically said, "Okay, well, we're not going to accept anything from you guys ever again." But it does point out the problem that you have to be, it starts there, right? Of the contributions that are being made, making sure that that things that are added to the source code are legit. If you are a source, a provider of one of those platforms, and then obviously as a consumer, that those open source toolkits get downloaded and used by developers all over the globe, millions of times, and how many of us really check the signature or the checksum on the distributions that we download?
Exactly, right? Or even know where to go look or bother to do it.
Or have they changed? Has there been an update? So forth, and that is where this starts, and I think that's where some of the SolarWinds pieces actually started. As well, to kind of get back to that.
Well, I think one of the fascinating things is in a couple of minutes we're going to talk about a recent discovery that was made about a rootkit that Microsoft accidentally signed called NetFilter. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think one of the most glorious things about this is even this attack was concerned about supply chain integrity. The executable checks its hash against the command and control system on a regular basis and replaces itself if the hash doesn't match. So in some ways, the attackers are much better about making sure that their binaries are staying intact and unmanipulated in legitimate supply chain things. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute.
Wow. Yeah.
Crazy. I'm going to go ahead and open up our first poll. We've got a question here. I'd like to see how many people already have something in place and are prioritizing the security of their supply chain. So are you already consciously aware of risks in the software integrity, how applications are retrieved, how you're doing application verification and signing, or is this kind of not a priority, or maybe it's a new topic and concern for your organization? So we'll leave that open as we talk on this next slide here. Yep. So I think one of the interesting things, and a nod to Key Factor here, Ted, this was a slide that you guys had created on some of the historical attacks on the supply chain. You want to talk on a couple of the pertinent points? Yeah,
I mean, it is something obviously that has been growing in awareness and in frequency. And I think it's something. I like the whole concept of shift left, right? That's one of the new IT buzzwords, but it's not just IT departments and developers that are shifting left. It's hackers as well, right? It's very difficult to attack, Azure, right, or AWS or so forth, right? It's hard to. Those are like the holy grails of Google Cloud. There's tons of security controls around that sort of thing. But if you can't attack, your primary target, then as an attacker, attack the things that target uses, and that becomes your way in. I think, there are a lot of pieces. Actually, maybe somewhat germane to this, I did see in the Q&A, Phil Stewart asked a question about what Key Factor does in terms of this. And that is one of the things that we've seen. So one of the challenges and the reason why these code signing attacks work, one of the things that we see is organizations do struggle with globally distributed development teams have a need to access signing certificates at any time, right? I've got Scrum teams and dev teams that are working on their own cadence. They need access to these keys to sign on when they need them. What happens is now those keys typically wind up sitting on build servers, workstations, things like that, where you don't have as much access control. They can get legs. If Phil cited an example here where an employee leaves, which is certainly a scenario. The other would be if there is a compromise of a system due to some sort of hack. It is well known that attackers will look for SSH keys and code signing certs because that expands the reach. Right now I can get malware signed by a legit certificate. Now I can get an SSH key that gives me root or some other elevated access to a server. As far as how Keyfactor handles that, not meant to be a plug for a Keyfactor product, but we do have a component we call Code Assure, which actually allows you to centralize the signing keys while still allowing for distributed access. So basically, that's where our signing keys live. They aren't sitting on a build server. They're actually sitting in an HSM fronted by this Code Assure platform that allows for control, policy, and auditability of the use of those keys. So if an employee leaves, along with the access that they lose to the environment, they lose access to the key to sign. And the keys can only be used to sign once they've been unlocked as a part of a DevOps approval process, right? So even developers don't have access to sign at any time that they want. So they can't sign some piece of malware on their way out the door or something like that if they're disgruntled or so forth. But I think those are the sorts of things, and I think the other part that's worth pointing out is that is one piece of a very large chain of things that need to be looked at, right? We've talked about pull requests, the code, the security of the code itself, all of those pieces are important, and it's only as good as its weakest link, right? Protecting the keys, so forth, right?
Exactly. And I think what's interesting to me is as I kind of look across this brief history of time of supply chain attacks, they're all of different sorts. If we think about, I think it was one of the D-Link ones that was, or maybe it was ASUS last couple of years, where they released their own key. Right. The kind of the misunderstanding of, I know I need to distribute my code signing firmware, and they accidentally distributed their private key as well. It's
that's not the first time that's happened, I'm sure. Right?
Exactly. And then we get more targeted things. We get things like Stuxnet and things that are much more targeted that are out there. And I think the interesting thing here is there's kind of an impact all the way through the supply chain. This isn't just something that affects manufacturers and developers, that this is something that if an organization is signing code for internal execution, whether that's scripts or they're buying commercial software and validating and then re-signing it, which is something that we're going to talk about as a remediation approach, that still needs to be done securely so that the pipeline doesn't end the moment you've gotten a piece of software and you validate it, that the integrity of that can change at any point. And then we even have things like Colonial pipeline. Now, it wasn't a code signing attack, but it shows that the supply chain and organizations are really subject to a myriad of different types of attacks. Some of them are targeted, some of them are indiscriminate. But something like a ransomware can come in, and today they're not extracting information. And this is kind of a point that I've been talking to organizations is, okay, how long before we get to a point where if we've got ransomware and they're already in the organization and they're encrypting and asking for a ransom, how long until they start exfiltrating information as well, and then asking for the ransom and then also having all that information? So, you think back to, 7-8 years ago with the Sony hack, and that was exfiltration of information, lots of embarrassing stuff.
And signing keys were stolen as a part of that.
Exactly, the signing keys. And I love the whole story about the malware that wound up getting signed as a prank with the Sony key. But those attackers could have made money by also using ransomware and encrypting it and still taking the info. So I don't think we're that far from having that, which means things that are not using secure code signing, whether that is keys that are sitting inside of PFX files or sitting on a build server or in a file system, without protections of something like a hardware security module, those are going to be at risk. And you may say, well, we protect against data exfiltration, but we see it, they're always finding something. And the next thing may be through a ransomware kind of attack.
Yeah. So Mark, I actually have a question for you that's kind of related to what, there's another piece that Phil asked in his same question about sort of the number of code signing certs and so forth. And I'm sure obviously you do a lot of work with your clients around implementing code signing, as you mentioned, signing internal pieces, Word macros, PowerShell, et cetera, as sort of a seal of approval. I think from what we've seen, there is in general, because these code signing certs are valued assets, there is a kind of force to try to reduce the number of those as much as possible. I actually, the head of a very large bank, when we were talking about code signing, once mentioned to me, in a perfect world, I'd have 2 code signing certificates, one for internal trust and one for external trust, for things that have to be trusted inside the company.
Yeah,
that would be it. And he said, admittedly, I'll never get there.
But
they actually institute a policy. They went to, they have a bank. There are people requesting code signing certs from all the public providers, all different parts, or they don't even know how many code signing certs they have, right?
Yeah.
So they went to all the major public providers and said, do not issue a code signing cert to us, our organization, unless we approve it. It took 2 years, but then the certs renewed. They at least found out where they were. And started working with them on, okay, how can we share
exactly.
But I'm curious, is that advice that you kind of also?
Well, kind of direct and indirect. So there's so many things I want to touch on there. So one of the things that we often talk to organizations about is using a CAA record. And in the DNS space for your public organization, you can control which certificate authorities in the public space can issue in your name because of that exact same problem. Now, we do it not just because of code signing, but it could be server authentication. The default behavior in the public CA space is if you could validate that you have some administrative control or abilities in the environment, we'll issue a cert that corresponds to your internet name. But the CAA record, I, as the central authority for certificates, can say, I only want one provider or a group of providers that we control, and I have the accounts to issue certs in our name. So I can make sure that there isn't some software group or some admin somewhere else that runs off and gets a code signing cert simply because he can sign up with an email address or something. It's very rare that we ever go into an organization that has 100% control of their code signing certs. More often than not, it's, I don't know why does Bob have that? That's kind of odd. I don't think I've ever gone in and seen an organization that has maybe fewer than 4 or 5 code signing certs, and they know exactly where they're at, how they're secured, how they're using them. It's usually, we do some, it's enabled. I don't know. Don't know where they're at.
It's funny you mentioned Android. I was playing around with the Android dev environment, just kind of writing my own hello world sort of thing. And what I think is kind of funny, I guess, to maybe throw Google under the bus slightly, that one arm of Google, and perhaps rightly so, was very stringent about enforcing Symantec's issuance policies and so forth around how they handled SSL certs, and basically threatened to, and then eventually, all but delisted them as a root, resulting in DigiCert and the acquisition and all of that, pretty much, almost put Symantec's SSL business out of business. On the other hand, I'm installing the Android development environment. And they say, well, okay, to sign submissions to the Google Play Store, you need to generate a key or a certificate. And we're going to generate self-signed. By default, it's a 25-year certificate. But if that cert expires, then you can't submit anything else to the Play Store. So we really kind of recommend you might go with 50. And from a PKI perspective, just stomach turn, right? So like, just different parts of the organization not having the same level of understanding as to what all of those practices mean.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Organizations also talk about, okay, I have the employee that's responsible for my app, my company app in the Play Store or so forth. They're the ones that sign the submissions. They have access to the key. And if they get disgruntled or leave,
exactly.
They could submit a so-and-so company stinks app.
Exactly. And more often than not, it's usually kind of around convenience. Now it's easier to do this. That the Google Play thing is, it's easier to do this, or organizations say, well, we don't really have the complexity to do something more secure. I just went ahead and closed the first poll on the supply chain priority, and the vast majority of people, 70% said yes, that there's some priority or focus on the supply chain. 30% said no, or it's not a focus. So that's good to know. As we move on, I'm going to open the next poll. This one is: has your organization made any changes after SolarWinds or the Colonial attack? So that's open as we talk here. So a couple of things we wanted to talk on is what are the lessons that organizations can take from the fact that we're now seeing things like SolarWinds and Colonial. And I'll tell you, something like SolarWinds wasn't a surprise to me. Would I have been able to guess it was SolarWinds? No, but in some ways, it's not all that far off from what we've talked about, and that being anyone that's developing software. When you have code signing keys, whether they're accidentally released, purposely manipulated, extracted, exfiltrated, the attackers are going to find ways to go. And frankly, here's my thinking and why I'm kind of glad you brought it up, Ted. It is, even with secure code signing, attackers are going to continue to shift. They're going to find new places. They're going to go to the source code. They're going to get inside of the secure code. But I think what it really kind of presents is the fact that organizations can't let their guard down. Whether it's SolarWinds, which in my mind was kind of a beautiful way of doing it, because guess what? Everybody runs, everybody's got, if it's not SolarWinds, it's going to be ServiceNow or something else. Like you go for something that's in every environment, you find some way of manipulating it, and you get a nice installed base. I think organizations have to realize that both things like Colonial Pipeline and SolarWinds is organizations a lot of times used to think about, what's my risk? Why would somebody want to attack me? I just make plastic cups, or I don't do anything sexy. I don't have any copyrights. I don't have any patents or secret recipes. Well, these attacks, SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, they're indiscriminate. They weren't written to attack Colonial Pipeline. They weren't written to infiltrate your organization because you use SolarWinds. It was a attack that took advantage of weaknesses and went wherever it could. Back in the day, we would call that a worm. It's a computer virus that just looks for the next thing it can get to. No one was targeting you. Now you compared it to something like Stuxnet, that was very targeted. That had a very specific target to go after. But I think organizations, as they think about their pipeline, they can't just go, I'm an injection molder. I don't have to worry about this. So for you guys, how do you help organizations kind of think about risks? Well, let me flip that a little bit. So obviously we know there's code signing. Are there ever organizations that kind of think about code signing as a way of protecting themselves from risks? Do organizations come to you and say, hey, we've heard about SolarWinds, we've heard about other types of code signing attacks. How do we do it better? Is that a conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more so we're seeing now in the IoT space, where there has been also a shift in terms of an awareness that code that can't be updated can't be secured, right? That you do have to have it. The FDA is a great example. It used to be if you had a medical device You would have an FDA certification, and you draw a box around everything about that device, hardware, how it worked, all the firmware that goes inside of it, and so forth. There's a 9-month certification process, and once that happens, you can't change anything. And actually, we did a PKI assessment a long time ago from an organization that set something up, and there were all kinds of mistakes, and I'm sure you would have same sorts of mistakes I'm sure you've seen over and over again as well, Mark. Root CAs are only valid for a year, and online root CAs, et cetera. But they're like, okay, this is great, but we can't change any of it because we have to recertify. And that was like 10 years ago or more. But there's been a new awareness that with the FDA, they're basically now saying that you really need to make your devices updatable, and updatable to only accept firmware that's authentic, which really is kind of nudge, wink, wink at code signing without specifically saying, please sign your code. But we are seeing a lot of folks now looking at, okay, if I'm going to sign this stuff, I'm signing, pacemaker firmware, for updates while it might actually be attached to the patient. How do I make sure there's an extreme level of protection of private keys for those sorts of things? That's absolutely a piece. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out, you mentioned, like, people do say, like, okay, I'm just making this device or whatever. That's not that secure, or not that, who would care about attacking, something of low security value. But the whole point, and a lot of times, especially with IoT, is it's not the device itself that's the thing that you want to attack. It's if the device authenticates weakly, then by pretending to be that device, I can gain access to a back-end network or something like that. There's a lot of cases. Home Depot a long time ago was hacked by someone pretending to be a HVAC piece of HVAC equipment. There was a casino that was hacked by someone pretending to be a fish tank heater. There's lots of scenarios like that where, it's not always about the device. It's you have to, and you mentioned it, right? It's the whole system, right? And attackers will examine the entire system and look where they can get in. I think SolarWinds is most interesting because, there is a knowledge. SolarWinds has a great SaaS-based and on-prem based configuration management platform, right? So they've got hooks into lots of people's systems and so forth, and that becomes a really attractive target. So I think that's the other thing of if you are using or making software that adds security to someone else's environment, you are a possible target of a supply chain. Even if your stuff itself may not be that interesting, your customer.
Exactly. And one of the challenges sometimes too is organizations may not even necessarily know what kind of risks they're bringing in. It's one thing to say, we've downloaded this software, we've educated our employees about this or that. In some ways, IoT is kind of that scary thing. I didn't realize that device I brought in is talking Bluetooth or is on the Wi-Fi, then has a tunnel back to some manufacturer, and even a lot of buildings or homes now they're smart homes, they're smart buildings. And one of the things I remember talking about last year was the fact that organizations don't really kind of do an inventory and audit of, say, a new building space they go into to know what kind of intelligent things are sitting in their building, whether it's light switches or pumps or whatever, that may wind up on their network or somehow traversing it, and what does it talk to and where does it go and all that kind of stuff. So it can really kind of be a little bit of a threat matrix. One of the other things that was kind of timely as I was putting this deck together was a story that Bleeping Computer came out just a couple of days ago about an issue. So Microsoft had incidentally and accidentally wound up signing a relatively new virus that's out there. It's being called the net filter. It's been linked back to Chinese command and control systems. And essentially, from a Windows perspective, anything that runs in the kernel of the Windows OS has to be signed by Microsoft. And they have a special code signing process for kernel mode code signing, very distinct from just regular code signing. And much like an app store, something that goes to the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, in this case, it's got to be submitted to Microsoft. Somehow Microsoft didn't catch what the code was doing, and they signed it. So in some ways, this isn't necessarily a theft of a key. It's not interjecting something between the developer and the consumer. It's, in this case, they put it through the legitimate process, and it didn't catch it. And it's actually kind of a doozy of a thing to let through. And this is the virus I was talking about. That's actually quite ingenious in that one of the things they discovered and they talk about in this article is the fact that it checks back on a few command and control systems and actually checks its own hash to see if anybody's manipulated the code, and then will re-download itself if that a hash has changed. So it in itself is trying to make sure that it stays operational. It's not manipulated. It's not injecting anything back. So in some ways, it's kind of a marvelous little piece of software. It's only a couple days out in the public now. So a little bit of a public service announcement. If you haven't looked this up, if you haven't heard about this, it's definitely worth noting. A couple of things that you can do, by the way. There's always ways that you can mitigate this stuff, but you should at least be aware of it if you're not up to date on that.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to, again, that's the weakest link piece, right? As you mentioned, right? And Microsoft, has extremely good protection of their signing keys. Has a very well defined process by which they get used, and they follow it. In this case, that's what what hack. But I think there is a recipe of the code that you have or use, make sure is inspected and analyzed, by third parties and static analysis tools, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
Once you've done that, sign it with a key that you're protecting carefully with a very defined process. And the other part is have a process to handle accidental signatures, right? So
exactly.
Right. Have a plan.
Yeah. And this is
Microsoft. It can certainly happen to others who don't.
Exactly. And this is a great example of that whole shift left. That if you look back in the early 2000s, the attack was getting VeriSign to issue a code signing certificate in the name of Microsoft, which Microsoft found out, got it revoked. And if you go digging into your computer store now inside of Windows, you'll still see these old revocation lists left over from VeriSign to make sure that those code signing certs will never be trusted. Well, that process is now much more secure. Microsoft has its own signing authority. So the attackers just moved to the beginning. Garbage in, garbage out. Let's just see if we can send malicious code to Microsoft and see if they'll sign it. So it's just a further evolution of that process. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close our next poll here on the has your organization made any changes? We had some feedback. We should have had a I don't know. We probably could have said I don't know, I don't care. But from the respondents, it was 50-50. Really between yes and no. So some organizations have made changes. Maybe some of those were just defaults without the I don't know. But that's in some ways not surprising.
Yeah, I think, from our perspective, I actually personally wasn't sure how to answer that because I don't think there were no super material changes other than perhaps a growing awareness that of paying more attention to this sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So how are organizations at risk? Because I think there's a couple of things. We can't just make this about people who sign the code. We can't make it just about the app stores being at risk. Frankly, everybody that's involved in the supply chain is really at risk. And that is from the inception of code, so that from the developers right through to the consumer and from an ongoing basis. So we can assume that the software developers and device manufacturers will probably be on some type of targeted approach. And that's simply because that is where the genesis of a lot of this is. But we can assume distribution, the app stores, the downloads, like most people have learned long ago, you don't download Microsoft Office for $19 off of some random website. It's like that. That's well known, but we certainly know things could get altered along there.
But I got a great deal.
Yeah, exactly. it. Yeah, I run it. I get a little ad each time. Yeah, that sounds like
it's certified.
Yeah. I think also we see that most organizations aren't very good about validating software that they're running or they download, even if it's a legitimate source. Not a lot of people are looking at the hash information. So here's a question for you, Ted. And I really don't know the answer.
Okay.
Is it easy to find hash information on the code that you guys release? Like, can I just go to keyfactor.com and type in file hash, or do I got to dig through a bunch of support articles? Like, how easy do you make it to find for your stuff?
Yeah, that's a fair point. So for the stuff that we have, the binaries we release, MSIs, all of the DLLs and so forth, there's no hash information per se, but it is all, every single one of those binaries, the MSI and all the executables in it are signed with our code signing certificate and can be checked. We have obviously the prime key piece. They have a process. We've just that merger has just been completed, so I'll probably have more details to share personally. I can get people like Thomas Gustafson on to talk at length about what they do. But from a Bouncy Castle and EJBCA perspective, I am certain that they have hashes and so forth available and signatures available for those pieces. We actually sort of lost in the noise from the prime key announcement is the fact that we actually are launching today as well a Keyfactor public GitHub that has source code for all of the, or will have more and more of the integrations around our platform added to our public GitHub, so that if organizations want to see how you can automate certificate delivery to IIS or to an F5 or to a Linux box over SSH or whatever, those are all available open source. And if it makes it easier with an SDK to be able to, if there's new integrations that people need to build and so forth, they can do that. GitHub does have abilities to do some of those to make sure that the code that we're supplying, we have the same issue there too, right?
Yeah.
Of if we're going to put source out there, it needs to be, we are very careful with the pull request from that perspective as far as who's allowed to contribute, but we do welcome community and partner contributions and that kind of stuff. But in doing so, we will have to start very carefully inspecting the contributions.
I don't want to be back here in a year talking about the Keyfactor issue.
But we are well aware, fortunately, of those sorts of things and are paying very close attention to it. But it is, there's power in open source, and there's a reason why so many products make use of those things. SolarWinds included, Keyfactor included, so forth. And almost every product that's out there uses some open source components for toolkits and so forth. It's very valuable, very useful, but it does carry some risks that we are starting to grow more awareness of.
Exactly, and I think the other interesting thing that came up as we were working on this was maybe a new twist. I don't necessarily know case law in every regard, but the fact that Colonial is now being sued because of the ransomware attack. And who knows the merits? I'm not going to go into that, but it certainly shows that organizations face risks not just from the attack itself, but potentially on their service ability of contracts and their customers, and it may not even necessarily be a pipeline next time. It could be, I make napkins and, I can't ship my napkins out to the grocery store, but I may have a contract that says I'll deliver that, and I could get sued. So I think we're starting to see organizations could be kind of facing threats from just being vulnerable and not having done something. And in a business space, I can see some value to that type of a claim of saying, hey, you should have done something and you didn't. As a result, you weren't able to fulfill your contract. So kind of new twists that are coming out.
Yeah, I have a bit of a soapbox about that. I mean, I do think that obviously if people aren't following best practices and so forth, those are things that need to be addressed, and that's something that's important. If we need guidelines and standards, we follow them. I do think it's interesting. There was an executive order on cybersecurity that does sort of initially in the federal government talk about creating frameworks for sharing information, establishing best practices around security, and hoping that those get followed, at least within the government, and having ways to help assure that they do. But that same sort of sharing, to me, I think, if you look at a lot of these attacks, they are, in a lot of cases, nation state type things that at least all indications are it's nation state type attacks. In the physical world, private organizations are not expected to defend themselves against bombs and airplanes and armies.
Force majeure. It's force majeure. Yeah, acts of terrorism and war and force majeure.
Right. But they, to me, the idea of they somehow in the cyber world they are sort of expected to try to defend themselves against nation states, which is not a fair fight. It's just, and so. To me, the only way you can help even the playing field is to encourage information sharing. The same sort of things that were in that executive order. Here's how we got attacked. Here's how we want to defend. And to be able to do so without worry about getting sued or going to jail because your organization got hacked. To me, if you're litigation and sending CIOs to jail because their organization got hacked, to me is the opposite of what you want to do in terms of encouraging sharing and coordination between private sector organizations to help defend themselves collectively against nation state type attacks. I think that's the only way you can help make it more of a fair fight.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to move us on here and open up our next poll. So our last poll is, what do you see as the biggest issue for organizations facing a SolarWinds situation? So potential liability, reputation, cybersecurity insurance, potential data theft, or something else, or unsure. So we now have a don't know, unsure. So let's make sure that everyone that's watching this can at least have some actionable things. Like what can people do today to mitigate some of these? And we can't say eliminate or get rid of it. It's impossible, but we can start doing something. I think we need to look at the cradle side of things, and developers and creators need to be doing secure signing, something that's auditable, something that has protections in place, maybe is hardware backed. End users need to have some process in place to validate what software they're running. Maybe even looking at things like execution policies of what's allowed to run. You can go rather draconian and say, hey, on my computer, only the following 6 binaries are allowed to run. That's difficult for many organizations.
It's hard to scale.
It is. But if I have line of business systems that are flipping switches and sending electricity, or moving oil pipes and that kind of stuff, I can say, hey, only these 6 things should be running on there. Bob shouldn't be on there with a web browser and Spotify. I don't need to allow everything. And the other thing is I'm not opposed to ever pushing back on my suppliers. If I'm buying software from places and they're not doing good code, I know whenever we go in and we work with organizations to do an RFP and they want to know about all of our protections, everything we do, I hope they're doing the same thing for when they go off and they buy software from Adobe or whoever it is, okay, how do you protect your code? How are you signing it? How are you protecting me as a vendor? And I don't necessarily know that organizations are doing that from a software perspective for their incoming things. But you have to realize that you're bringing this virtual thing into your network and allowing it to run. I think they should be looking at that all around. And I think lastly, that you need to have something that is protecting you against these indiscriminate attacks, the ransomwares. It's not just about somebody being interested in you and targeting you, and you can either write that off as saying we don't have anything of interest. You're at risk, even from indiscriminate attacks. It's no longer just a targeted space. What's your take on these, or would you add anything to the list?
I might add one or two. I mean, to me, kind of working backwards, right? I think the message is sign your code, or make sure that the code you're using is signed. Sign code with keys that are very carefully protected, and not just sitting around. Know where your signing keys are and have processes to help protect them, whether they're in HSMs or so forth. And the other piece is, of course, make sure that you have a confidence that what you are signing is deserving to be signed.
Yeah.
I think that's the other piece too, is if you have source code, if you have binaries, so forth, make sure there's a process that is validating that there hasn't been some injection of malicious pull requests and things like that that are working their way into those things, right? Protect the source code that you have, and make sure that the code that's being created is free of, as much as you can, free of vulnerabilities, and can be updated securely with signed updates if some vulnerability is found out at some point down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So cradle to grave.
Yep.
The other thing, we touched on this a little earlier. It's not set forget. It's never going to be, I got a cert, I'm done, or I set up code signing and I'm done. It's constant vigilance, and in some ways you need to think about this being tied directly back to your reputation. It could be your business. So in the case of the semantic public CA space, because of that lack of vigilance, the business was essentially worthless at that point, and had to be kind of transferred in order to salvage it. If you're a software developer and you write software and it's not secure or it's been compromised, it could mean the end of the business, or if not, an incredible hit to your reputation. I mean, think about it. We're sitting here talking about cybersecurity attacks, and we keep mentioning SolarWinds. I'm sure they would love to move on from this, but nobody wants to be tied back to that. It's just not a great situation to be in. So secure code, the life cycle, and frankly, I'm glad that we touched on a little bit of the open source, the garbage in, garbage out. If you're not examining the code, and that could be not just from an outside attacker, but rogue employee, disgruntled employee, or the ever, I'm going to plant a back door in case they fire me next year kind of thing. Code really needs to be validated all the way through.
I do actually. Eddie posted in the chat, how do we get vendors who refuse to sign code to do so? I think that's really interesting. I'm not aware of too many vendors that refuse to do that, but to me that would be a giant red flag.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, yes, you could, if you have a policy in your organization that you will only run signed code, you could sign it yourselves. The problem is you may not know what you're signing. So like, to me, that's it's certainly a concern, right? Because that signature is effectively a seal of approval of, yes, we, the vendors, stand behind this software. It was created, in accordance with our processes, and it has not changed since we validated and did this build. And here it is for you to use it. To me, without that, that's a big red flag.
Exactly. And I'll tell you, if you're a business and you've got a piece of software that's important to you, you have the most important tool to make this happen. You say, if you want my business and you want my money, sign this. Otherwise, we're going to move off. Now, you don't have to make it an overnight threat. You could say, hey, this isn't going to work for us. If you're not going to do this, I'm going to give you a roadmap. In 6 months, I want you to be able to start providing hashes of binaries that you provide. Within 12 months, I want you using a secure code signing process. If you don't achieve these goals, then we're going to be off of your platform. And then you as the organization spend the next 12 months looking for viable alternatives. And maybe it's a matter of educating them and saying, hey, if you don't know what this is, right, we'll help you. It's not our business, but it's frankly, we can't find some other way of doing this. You're the only one here, but you're part of my supply chain and you need to be secure.
Yeah, I think the other part is, okay, then what assurance can you give me that the software that you're sending me, first of all, came from you to start with, but then it was created with some level of rigor and process.
Yeah, exactly. And then to your point, it's red flags. So
and hasn't been modified, right, on its way to me, right? Those are all just,
Yeah, exactly. Well, Natalie, do you want to take care of our Q&A here and usher us through the end?
Yes, that was actually a great lead into our Q&A section. So we've got a couple others here, and I think we've got a few minutes to get some answered. So question from John: what are some ways for a code signing API to enforce that proper virus scanning, malware scanning, supply chain inspection is being performed?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you, I'm happy to start on that, Mark, but I think to me, the signature is comes after the validation piece. So I think it's a question of making sure that, you're going to have some sort of DevOps toolchain piece, a process whereby code gets submitted, gets built, gets approved for release, and then a signature occurs. I think you do want to make sure, however you've implemented that, regardless of how you're, whatever product or process you're using to protect your signing keys, to validate your code, that those things integrate in such a way that that you do have a level of assurance that whatever checks are in place, QA, security, vulnerability analysis, have occurred as a part of your process before the signature is allowed to be performed. And there's ways to do that with technical controls and products. There's also just sort of process and human pieces of making sure that there's someone tracking those steps along the way to make sure they happen. I don't know today of something that all-in-one is a great code signing platform and vulnerability analysis QA platform. Those two things tend to be separate. So it's about hooking them up in a way that ensures you that those two things happen in the right order.
Well, Ted, either you're marvelous at hiding future plans, or you just really came up with the next feature set for Code Assure, right? Where you're like, I don't know, there's not out there.
There are very different. There are different spaces, though. I think the software assurance, QA, those are different.
Which kind of strikes me. I guess in some ways I kind of see like code signing as like the official stamp that this is good, it's ready to go. It kind of surprises me that it's not.
Maybe you're right. Maybe there will be a wave of adoption of secure code signing in the software QA space. Could happen.
Yeah. And then I guess that the other thing I would add on to that, to John's question is if you're not the one that's doing the signing and you're not the one that's doing that, it may be a matter of talking to your software providers to say, what is your process? What do you do before you sign it? So it may just be a matter of having this conversation.
I think the other thing too is if you or your vendors are going through audits and so forth. I know we're actually in the middle of getting a ISO certification. But a lot of it comes down to not just having the process, but having evidence that it has occurred. So that's the other part, is making sure that evidence is gathered and something that you can use to defend the fact that you really are doing it.
Okay, well, with the last couple minutes we've got here, a question to just bring this all home and bring it all together. Can organizations prevent cyber attacks through code signing? What's your final take on that?
I'm going to let Ted go first on that one.
I would say yes, but I don't think we've talked about this, sort of looking at the whole system, and even supply chain attacks in general are sort of all about the end-to-end system. It is a part of a complete nutritious breakfast, but not the entire thing, right? It's something you absolutely should be doing. But just because you're doing it doesn't mean that you're secure.
Yeah. And I both agree and disagree with you.
Okay.
I'll say it can't prevent. It's another tool in your tool belt, like you said, part of that grouping of things together. There are ways of remediating some of their risks. I think as organizations, I think if we ever think about preventing cyber attacks, it's not. We're remediating. We're moving the risks somewhere else. Even if we have things like education and we have tools, we have firewalls. Those things are still systems that could break. They could be misconfigured. We're shifting that risk somewhere else. So rather than my employee getting something and accidentally clicking on it, I've got some tool that's blocked it or is redirected it. But if it doesn't do it, it gets through. So I always look at cyber attacks as things where hopefully we can mitigate the risks and put it into places and containers where we can control it. I often kind of say it's a bit like the concept of the preservation of energy. You can't get rid of energy; it just transforms. Same thing from a cybersecurity attack. And I'm just hopeful that we can help organizations stick it in a box, know what the box is, where it's at, and they don't have to worry about it as much. But it won't go away. So I would say no, we can't prevent it, and code signing won't do that.
Yep.
Okay, well, we are right about at time. So before we officially wrap up, Ted and Mark, any final thoughts you just want to share with everyone in attendance today?
I think we've wrapped up a lot of the pieces, but obviously want to thank you, Mark, for having me on. It's definitely been a pleasure. I had a lot of fun. And,
No, well, thanks for joining.
Great conversation.
Yeah, it's always fun to do this, and I appreciate you coming along. And I would wrap it up by just reminding everybody, wherever you are in the supply chain, we all have a role in it, and we can't rely on everyone else to keep us secure. So we all have to take part in this. Thanks, Natalie.
Well,
Cool.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be available online later. And we, of course, welcome any feedback, additional questions, comments via email or social. Don't forget to check out office hours coming up on July 8th and keep an eye out for more webinars to come. And enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, everybody. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.